Volunteers was a movie that had a lot of promise for me. It had my favorite comedic actor of all time in John Candy. I do like Tom Hanks. Nicholas Meyer was the director. Nicholas Meyer, if you don't know who he is, he's most famous for Star Trek, but he's written some books and he did a made for TV series called The Day After, which was about nuclear holocaust. That actually is not a bad movie to this day, although the effects don't hold up. It's just kind of a today we maybe call that a docudrama, just about what would be like to survive a nuclear holocaust. Pretty interesting. He also wrote a famous Sherlock Holmes story called like the 7% Solution or something along those lines, and made quite a name for himself for a while. But responsible mainly for Wrath of Khan, which is in my top five all time movies. I'm definitely going to talk about that sometime. And Star Trek Six: The Undiscovered Country, which is yet another great movie. So everything he does seems to turn to gold. So I'd never heard of Volunteers, and I couldn't believe this combo. I was like, well, this has got some serious potential. And I'll just tell you from the outset, look, what I'm looking for from a comedy is just to at least laugh. I don't necessarily need a great story. In fact, I've always found that a little weird when reviewers don't like a story of a comedy, but that leads me into something that Volunteers really highlights about the dangers of making a comedy. When I say dangers, I mean the danger that it may be a very bad film. Just it. What is a bad comedy, by the way? Is it a bad movie or not funny? What is it? It seems to me that a comedy should at least be funny, but then maybe if it has a story, it can get over that. And that's where this found itself in a very precarious position. So I've identified four basic ideas about comedies, and all comedies share some of these things, but one area is stronger than another for some. So, like for example, some comedies focus on story. The story itself is comedic. So I think Princess Bride would be a good example of that, with Andre the Giant, and that's who I remember the most from that movie. Billy Crystal's in that, and if you haven't seen it, you're missing a good movie. It's really good. But I've seen it a million times. It doesn't make me laugh anymore because I know all the jokes, but it's still humorous to me, and the story's really good. And it would be a really good example, in my opinion, of a comedy that focuses primarily on story and not comedic gags or anything like that. Well, what would be the opposite of that? Something that says, well, the story doesn't matter as much, but what matters more is the comedy itself. Well, I would think Happy Gilmore would be a good example of that. This is where the gags are more important than the story. There's just a lot of diversions in Happy Gilmore, and yet it's still a great movie. It's still funny, when you watch it. So, and some of that has to do if you like Adam Sandler, which leads me to another type of comedy, which is the actor that's in the movie. The sometimes it features an actor, and that's kind of what makes it a comedy. Ford Fairlane with Andrew Dice Clay would probably be a really good example of that, where it's just him and his comedy is the feature of the film. And then a fourth example, one I find really interesting, is a character study, where the character's funny, and that would be Polyester, would be my pick, just as an example of that. Polyester, I'm going to do a review of that soon, is an amazing film, amazing movie. I did not, and you know how sometimes you go in a movie, you don't think it's going to be good, and so you have low expectations, which is what happens, and it rises above it, so you end up enjoying it. For me, that was Cannonball Run. This was because I just thought it was going to be awful. It was much funnier than I was expecting it to be. It understood what it was. I thought it wouldn't realize it was a cheap ripoff, and no, it was embracing what it was, and that made it funnier than I expected. But with Polyester, sorry to get on the sidetrack here, but I wanted to just talk about how great of a movie this is for a moment. With Polyester, not only did I have low expectations, I did not expect brilliance, which is what that was. But it's about the main character. And so Volunteers finds itself in a weird place. It's trying to tell you a story, and it's trying to give you comedic gags at the same time. And you have to pick one. You know, if you're going to pick a story, the story needs to be kind of funny to get the comedy out of the story. But if you're going to pick gags, then the gags have to be funny. They can't just be there. And again, I think all these films have, to one degree or another, fit deeper into one area and lesser so into another. So like Tom Hanks's character is a very specific character, but the comedy's not really about his character. And there are times where they even break the fourth wall a little bit, and there's just some gags that just don't land. And then there's a second thing with comedies that I thought other people might find kind of interesting that I find interesting is, have you ever noticed, and after I say this, if you haven't noticed it, you'll start to. Some comedies know their limits. So they'll front load the best jokes. They'll put the best moments at the beginning, and then it will just taper off. And I think the theory behind that is, like with stand-up comics, they want a good opener, because if the person who does the opening is really funny, it livens up the audience, they'll laugh at the rest of the show. And I wonder if they do that. And I think Volunteers attempted that. The opening seasons of Volunteers are very funny. And I was like, I bet this is the best they got. I could just kind of tell. I was like, I bet this is the best they got. And there were a few moments scattered throughout that were pretty funny, but generally speaking, not a very good film. 2 stars. I wouldn't give it 1 star because I was never bored. You got to bore me to get 1 star. And 2 stars, as I've said in the past, I don't consider necessarily an absolutely awful movie, because it's not. It's okay, but nothing to write home about. I will say one final thing. This movie highlights how great John Candy really is. Even in the midst of a movie that's just flopping miserably, John Candy still brings it. He's great in it. He's great. Now, he's not doing anything exceptional. He's just John Candy in the jungle. But it's awesome. Like, I was like, well, I got my money's worth. I wanted John Candy, and I got it. And you can just see his value in this. It's like, wow, this guy can make anything funny. Just by being himself, apparently. And I can't say enough. If you haven't seen a John Candy movie, may I recommend Uncle Buck? This is just John Candy at his best, and would be another good example of a feature actor that brings out the comedy. I don't want to confuse you, though. Volunteers does not use John Candy that way. It is struggling between gags and narrative, and it doesn't bring either. I would not recommend seeing this movie. 2 stars at best.